threatened Canada. They were foolish to do it. And so I said, we're going to stop all negotiations with Canada right now until they straighten out their act.
U.S. President Donald Trump repeating his rhetoric over Canada becoming the 51st state, days after saying trade negotiations between the two countries have ended.
The trade negotiations between the United States and Canada have hit a historic low, sparking a confrontation that could reshape bilateral relations. President Donald Trump, known for his unconventional rhetoric and aggressive trade policies, recently declared that all trade talks with Canada were officially over. The trigger for this abrupt decision was Canada's Digital Services Tax, DST, which targets major U.S. tech giants like Google, Amazon, and Meta. The tax, introduced in 2024 and set to take effect on July 1st, is estimated to raise nearly $7 billion over 5 years. But Trump's fury was not solely due to the DST. It was the culmination of years of simmering tensions over trade imbalances, tariffs, and long-standing grievances. The controversy deepened when Trump made a provocative statement, suggesting that Canada should become the 51st state. While the remark was widely viewed as hyperbole, it marked a dramatic escalation in the trade dispute. Trump's rhetoric was a calculated move in his ongoing quest for leverage in international negotiations. He has long criticized Canada's trade policies, particularly its dairy protection system, which shields farmers through price controls and quotas. Despite the system's inclusion in the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, Trump has repeatedly labeled it as unfair, calling for it to be dismantled. This belief was compounded by his dissatisfaction with Canada's refusal to abandon the DST, a policy introduced under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. The political tension reached a boiling point with the introduction of new tariffs. Trump warned that unless Canada reversed its stance on the DST within a week, tariffs would be imposed on key Canadian exports, including steel, aluminum, and dairy. For Trump, this was not merely about securing a trade deal. It was about sending a message to Canada and the world that America would no longer accept what it perceived as unfair practices. However, behind the scenes, Prime Minister Mark Carney was working to de-escalate the situation. While publicly avoiding direct confrontation with the U.S., Carney and his team were exploring avenues to ease the standoff. The digital services tax was a major point of contention, but Carney acknowledged privately that Canada might be willing to show flexibility on the issue if it would lead to a broader resolution. The primary challenge, however, was protecting Canada's agricultural sector, which has long relied on supply management policies. As negotiations stalled, both sides prepared for a showdown. For Trump, the issue was not just about securing a deal, but about maintaining the appearance of strength ahead of the July 9th deadline for his 90 Deals in 90 Days campaign. Yet, the reality on the ground suggested that the 90-day target was increasingly unlikely to be met, with little progress made on any significant agreements. Meanwhile, Canada had its own priorities, including securing tariff relief on steel and aluminum, vital industries that have been negatively affected by Trump's protectionist policies. In this high-stakes battle, both leaders found themselves stuck in a political game of chicken, where one wrong move could lead to serious economic repercussions for both countries. As the deadline loomed, the stakes only grew higher. Trump's 90 Deals in 90 Days campaign, which was meant to be a cornerstone of his re-election strategy, was quickly devolving into a symbol of his administration's failures in international trade. With little to show for his bold promises, Trump faced mounting pressure from both domestic and international sources. The U.S. economy, while still robust, was beginning to feel the pinch of escalating tariffs. Small businesses and manufacturers, particularly those that relied on imports from China and Canada, were struggling with rising costs and uncertain futures. Yet, despite the growing unease, Trump remained steadfast in his approach, believing that pushing his trade agenda would eventually force his adversaries to yield. He framed the trade wars as necessary to reclaim American power on the global stage, insisting that tariffs were an effective tool in leveling the playing field. But this aggressive stance was starting to alienate some of his closest allies, including Canada, which was becoming increasingly frustrated with the U.S. tactic of using tariffs as a bargaining chip. Behind closed doors, Prime Minister Carney was working tirelessly to explore alternatives that could avoid a full-blown trade war with the U.S. While Canada was not willing to abandon its supply management system, one of the pillars of its agricultural policy, Carney seemed open to finding a compromise on the DST, provided it would lead to a broader trade deal. However, his patience was wearing thin. Carney knew that Canada could no longer wait indefinitely for a deal. The Canadian economy, already under pressure from U.S. tariffs, was beginning to show signs of strain. According to Statistics Canada, the manufacturing sector had seen layoffs rise to a 5-year high, with auto parts factories in cities like Windsor, Ontario, already suffering as a result of disrupted trade flows. The pressure from within Canada was growing, especially as the country's dependence on the U.S. market had become increasingly evident. Yet, Carney had also been working to diversify Canada's economic relationships. In the face of Trump's tariffs, the Canadian government had secured a long-term partnership with the European Union. This deal, which focused on increasing trade in sectors like clean energy and aerospace, was becoming a crucial backup plan if relations with the U.S. continued to deteriorate. The EU's economic strength and its willingness to invest in Canadian infrastructure projects presented a viable alternative to Canada's reliance on the U.S. market. But for now, the U.S.-Canada relationship remained fragile. Carney's diplomatic efforts were increasingly at odds with Trump's demands. The clock was ticking, and while Carney remained optimistic that a deal could be reached, he made it clear that Canada would not be held hostage indefinitely by American demands. The Prime Minister began signaling that if no deal was reached by July 21st, Canada would impose new tariffs on select U.S. agricultural goods, aerospace components, and other consumer exports. The prospect of such tariffs, though not ideal, was becoming more likely. Meanwhile, in Washington, Trump's economic advisors were scrambling to keep his agenda on track. With the July 9th deadline for his 90 Deals campaign rapidly approaching, the Trump administration found itself under increasing scrutiny. Many of the so-called deals Trump had touted were little more than framework agreements, with few concrete terms in place. The deal with the UK over tariff cuts for autos and aerospace, for example, sidestepped critical issues such as steel and aluminum, leaving many analysts questioning the substance of these agreements. The failure to secure meaningful deals with key trading partners like Canada and China raised concerns about the effectiveness of Trump's trade policies. Critics argued that his aggressive tactics, far from boosting America's standing on the world stage, were instead alienating vital allies and damaging long-term relationships. Even Trump's most ardent supporters were beginning to question whether his trade war strategy was sustainable in the face of mounting economic challenges. As July 9th drew nearer, the situation became more dire. The trade war, once hailed as a bold move to assert American dominance, was now beginning to backfire. With the U.S. economy showing signs of strain and critical partners like Canada and China resisting further concessions, Trump's trade campaign appeared to be faltering. His administration had promised to reset global trade relationships, but as the deadline for his 90 Deals in 90 Days campaign approached, only vague promises and partial agreements had materialized. In Canada, the threat of new tariffs hung over the economy like a dark cloud. Prime Minister Carney, who had initially sought a diplomatic resolution to the trade standoff, was now preparing for the worst. The Canadian government was readying countermeasures, including tariffs on U.S. agricultural goods and aerospace components, which would have a significant impact on American industries already grappling with the fallout from Trump's other tariff decisions. Carney's patience had worn thin, and with the July 21st deadline for retaliatory tariffs looming, the message from Ottawa was clear. Canada would not back down. The Canadian government was also exploring the possibility of increasing its trade ties with Europe and other regions, shifting its reliance away from the U.S. market. European investment in Canadian infrastructure and clean energy projects was growing, providing a cushion against the economic fallout from the ongoing tariff disputes. For Carney, this shift was not just a fallback strategy, it was a proactive move to reduce Canada's dependency on the U.S., particularly as Trump's unpredictability made it difficult to rely on America as a stable trading partner. On the U.S. side, Trump was feeling the heat. His ambitious trade promises, particularly the 90 Deals in 90 Days campaign, had failed to deliver tangible results. While his administration had secured a temporary relief deal with China and a framework agreement with the UK, neither deal had fully addressed the core issues that had triggered Trump's tariff offensive in the first place. Worse still, Trump's approval ratings had taken a hit, with his support on economic issues dropping from 45% to just 35% in recent months. The economic pain caused by tariffs was beginning to be felt by consumers, particularly those in industries reliant on imports from Canada and China. As inflation continued to rise and consumer prices climbed, Trump's critics grew louder. Many wondered whether his trade war strategy was truly serving the American people, or whether it was an exercise in political posturing aimed at securing leverage in upcoming re-election campaigns. Even the Federal Reserve, under pressure from the White House to cut interest rates, held firm, warning that the full effects of the tariffs would take time to materialize in the economy. The Fed's cautious approach highlighted the uncertainty surrounding Trump's economic policies, and it became increasingly clear that his trade agenda was doing more to stoke division than to secure the promised victories. Meanwhile, in Canada, the ramifications of the trade war were increasingly evident. Communities that relied on cross-border trade with the U.S. were feeling the strain. Cities like Windsor, Ontario, which had long been economic hubs due to their proximity to Michigan, saw factories shut down and supply chains disrupted as tariffs raised the cost of doing business. Small businesses that relied on exports to the U.S. faced rising costs, while Canadian consumers were left grappling with higher prices. It was clear that while Trump's administration might be pursuing a bold economic strategy, it was the everyday workers and families who would bear the brunt of the fallout. With the July 9th deadline fast approaching, the possibility of a trade war between the U.S. and Canada was becoming increasingly likely. Canada had already signaled its readiness to impose tariffs on U.S. goods if no agreement was reached by July 21st. Prime Minister Carney had successfully positioned Canada to weather the storm, with a strong strategic partnership with Europe and a growing focus on diversifying its trade relationships. But the U.S., with its ongoing tariff wars and mounting political tensions, seemed unwilling to make meaningful concessions. Trump's focus on leverage, legacy, and his America First agenda left little room for compromise, even with Canada, a longtime ally. As the trade negotiations reached a critical juncture, both countries were at a crossroads. Whether a deal could be struck before the July 21st deadline remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: the U.S.-Canada relationship was forever changed. With Trump's heavy-handed tactics, Canada had been forced to rethink its reliance on the U.S., and its future trade policies would no longer be defined by American demands. The U.S., for its part, had learned that even its closest neighbors and allies could no longer be counted on as dependable partners. In this high-stakes game of international diplomacy, the ultimate cost would be borne by workers, businesses, and families on both sides of the border. The trade war might have started as a battle for leverage, but it had become a fight for the future of global economic relations. With the dust settling, the world watched to see whether Trump's vision of a new world order would come to fruition or whether the economic pain would force a reckoning in Washington. One thing was certain: Canada, under Carney's leadership, had begun to chart its own path, one that no longer relied on the goodwill of its southern neighbor. The power dynamics of the U.S.-Canada relationship had shifted, and the coming months would reveal just how deep the divide had become.